When I stepped out of the bedroom in my new floral dress, my daughter-in-law looked at me and said, "Don't wear that outfit. You look like a ridiculous old woman." The words sliced through me like a serrated knife, each syllable tearing a new wound. A ridiculous old woman. I froze in the doorway, my fingers trembling against the doorframe as I watched Melissa's face contort with that peculiar mix of pity and disgust I'd grown accustomed to over the past few years. My son Mark sat on the couch, his eyes suddenly fixed on his phone, pretending he hadn't heard, but he had. We all had. The air in the living room turned thick and suffocating, the afternoon sunlight no longer warm but harsh and revealing. I could feel it highlighting every line on my face, every strand of silver in my hair. Ridiculous old woman. The words echoed in the silence as I stood there, 55 years old and suddenly a stranger in my own home. I just meant something more flattering would be better for the dinner, Melissa added, her voice softer now, but the damage already done. I felt a cold sweat break across my back. The dress had cost $189.99 at Nordstrom last week, a splurge I'd justified because, for the first time in months, something on a rack had made me feel pretty. I'd spent 37 minutes in the fitting room, turning and evaluating, convincing myself that the floral pattern wasn't too young, that the cut complemented what remained of my waistline. Now those 37 minutes seemed pathetic, a delusional exercise. "It's fine," I managed, my voice emerging strangled and thin. "I'll change." I turned back toward the bedroom, my knees weak, my throat tight with the effort of holding back tears. Behind me, I heard Melissa's whispered comment to Mark. "She's just so sensitive these days." My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out whatever my son might have replied. In my bedroom, I locked the door and sank onto the edge of the bed, the floral fabric pooling around me in what now seemed like a garish mockery of youth. This dinner was important. My son's law firm partners and their wives, the kind of networking event that Mark insisted would help his path to partnership. "It's important to show we have a stable family life," he had explained, when he invited me to live with them after Henry died. 18 months I'd been here, in their guest room that never quite became mine despite the 43 pictures I'd brought from my old life, despite the quilt Henry and I had bought on our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. 18 months of gradually taking up less and less space, of making myself useful with babysitting their 2 children, of cooking meals that Melissa would subtly critique or quietly remake. I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror across the room. When had I become invisible? Or worse, not invisible enough. My face was still my face, the same blue eyes, the same cheekbones, but somewhere along the way, the world had decided these features had an expiration date. At what precise moment had I transitioned from a woman to a ridiculous old woman? I traced my finger along the laugh lines around my eyes. Henry had called them character marks. Each one earned through joy, he would say. Now they just seemed like flashing neon signs announcing my obsolescence. The tears came then, silent but unstoppable. I reached for my phone and pulled up the photo gallery, scrolling back through the years. There I was at 45, at Henry's company picnic, my hair still mostly brown, my smile confident. There at 50, on our last vacation before his diagnosis, standing on a beach in Maui at sunset. I swiped further back, 40, 35, 30, watching myself grow younger while something inside me grew colder. In none of those photos had I looked in the mirror and seen a ridiculous old woman. But apparently that's what I'd become. A knock on the door startled me. "Mom." Mark's voice, hesitant. "We need to leave in 20 minutes. "I'll be ready," I called back, amazed at how normal I could make myself sound while falling apart inside. I stood up, unzipped the floral dress, and let it fall to the floor. In my closet hung the wardrobe I'd curated since moving in with them, increasingly neutral, increasingly forgettable. I selected a navy pantsuit I'd worn to countless functions during Henry's corporate career. Safe, invisible, appropriate. As I buttoned the jacket, I caught sight of my wedding ring, the diamond catching the light. Henry had been gone for 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Cancer took him quickly, from diagnosis to death in just 11 months. He never called me old, never made me feel like I was fading. With him, I had always been seen. The drive to the restaurant was silent, except for Melissa's occasional directions to Mark about where to park. I sat in the back seat like a child, watching the city lights blur past the window, each one a distant star in a universe that no longer seemed to have a place for me. The restaurant was upscale, the kind with minimalist decor and menu prices that made me wince internally. 8 couples gathered around a long table, all in their 30s like Mark and Melissa, all gleaming with that particular sheen of people who still believed their ascent would never end. I was seated between a tax attorney named Craig and his wife Bethany, a yoga instructor who looked at me with the distant politeness one reserves for an artifact in a museum. Mark mentioned you used to work in publishing, she asked after the appetizers arrived. Yes, I was a senior editor at Patterson House for almost 20 years, I replied, noticing how her eyes widened slightly at the number. I specialized in women's fiction and memoirs. How interesting. Did you enjoy it? Past tense. Always the past tense now. Very much. I worked with some remarkable writers. I didn't add that I'd been the one to acquire 3 books that later became New York Times bestsellers, or that I'd been nominated for the Maxwell Editorial Excellence Award in 2017. Those accomplishments seemed to belong to someone else now. Someone who wasn't a ridiculous old woman. And do you do anything now? Bethany asked, cutting her tuna tartare into precise squares. The question hung between us. Do you do anything now? As if existence itself wasn't enough. As if the act of continuing to breathe past a certain age required justification. I help with Mark's children, I said finally. Aiden is 7 and Emma is 4. That must be rewarding, she said, already turning slightly toward the person on her other side. I recognized the dismissal, the completion of her social obligation to make conversation with her colleague's mother. I took a sip of my water and glanced around the table. 8 couples engaged in animated conversation, laughing, leaning in, sharing the conspiracy of youth and relevance, and me, the lone satellite, orbiting their bright planet from a cold and distant space. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment of escape. In the elegant bathroom with its ambient lighting and fresh orchids, I leaned against the marble counter and stared at my reflection. My makeup was tasteful, my silver-streaked hair neatly styled in the bob I'd adopted 3 years ago when my stylist of 14 years gently suggested it was more age-appropriate. I looked, fine, presentable, not ridiculous, not overtly old, just invisible. A young woman emerged from one of the stalls, perhaps 30, with a sleek black dress and artfully tousled hair. She barely glanced at me as she washed her hands, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror for a fraction of a second before sliding away, as if the sight of me might somehow contaminate her with age. I watched her apply a fresh coat of lipstick, fluff her hair, and stride confidently back to the dining room, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. I remained, suddenly aware that I was holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale, to inhale, again deeply. This was what it had come to, being grateful for the brief acknowledgement of a stranger's glance. When I returned to the table, no one had noticed my absence. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone in a stream, present but irrelevant, changing nothing about its course. The evening crawled by in a blur of forced smiles and polite nods. I declined dessert, claiming a headache that no one questioned. In the car ride home, Melissa and Mark dissected the evening, weighing which connections seemed most promising, which partners had shown the most approval. I gazed out the window, wondering how I had become so thoroughly erased. You were so quiet tonight, Mom, Mark finally said, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. Everything okay? I almost told him then about the dress, about the hurt, about the gradual process of becoming invisible, but the words died in my throat as Melissa jumped in. I think your mom was just tired. It's a lot of stimulation. Compared to her normal routine, as if my days were empty, meaningless loops of existence, as if I hadn't built a life of substance before this current purgatory. The assumption burned, but I swallowed the fire. It was just a bit noisy for me, I conceded, hating myself for the capitulation. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2:17 a.m., I sat at the small desk in the corner of my room, opened my laptop, and created a new document. Invisible, I typed at the top, then began to write. The words poured out of me about Henry, about my career, about the slow erosion of my sense of self since his death, about the floral dress and Melissa's words, about Bethany's dismissal, about the young woman in the bathroom whose glance had skipped over me like a stone on water. I wrote until the sky began to lighten, until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned. 6,412 words. When I finally closed the laptop, something had shifted inside me, a small flame of defiance, where there had only been smoldering resignation. I climbed back into bed, and finally fell asleep, dreamless and deep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the children getting ready for school. For a moment, I considered staying in bed, claiming that headache had worsened, but the small flame inside me flickered, urging me forward. I dressed in my usual attire, neutral slacks, a beige sweater, and went to the kitchen to help with breakfast. "Grandma, can you sign my permission slip?" Aiden thrust a crumpled paper toward me as I entered. "It's for the Science Museum trip next week. I'll sign it, honey," Melissa intercepted, taking the paper from his hand. "Grandma doesn't need to worry about school forms." She didn't look at me as she said it, focused on pouring cereal for Emma. "Actually," I heard myself say, the word emerging before I'd fully formed the thought, "I'd be happy to sign it, and I'd love to chaperone the trip if they need parents, or grandparents." Melissa paused, spoon suspended over the bowl. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. They have plenty of volunteers already." "How do you know?" Aiden asked, his 7-year-old logic cutting through the pretense. "You didn't even check the form." I saw Melissa's jaw tighten, the subtle shift of someone preparing a reasoned argument for an unreasonable position. But before she could speak, I reached out and gently took the form from her hand. "Let's just check, shall we?" I said, scanning the paper. Sure enough, there was a section for volunteer chaperones. I grabbed a pen from the counter and filled in my name, then signed the permission portion. "There, all set." "But Mom was going to," Melissa began. "They need 4 chaperones," I interrupted, pointing to the form. "It says they only have 2 so far. Now they have 3. If you want to be the 4th, there's still space." I handed the form back to Aiden, who shoved it into his backpack with the casual disregard of a child for administrative details. "Thanks, Grandma," he said, already moving on to more pressing concerns like whether he could have chocolate milk instead of regular. The exchange lasted perhaps 45 seconds, but it felt monumental. I had asserted myself, claimed space, refused invisibility. The small flame grew a fraction brighter. That afternoon, while the house was empty, I returned to my laptop and reread what I'd written in the night. The raw emotion of it surprised me, the anger underneath, the hurt, the fierce desire to matter that pulsed beneath the resignation. On impulse, I opened my email and scrolled through my contacts, looking for a name I hadn't thought about in months. There she was, Diane Levitt, my former colleague from Patterson House, now a senior editor at Beacon Press. We'd fallen out of touch after I left to care for Henry during his illness, but we'd been friends for nearly 15 years before that. I began to compose an email, then hesitated. What exactly was I? Hoping for pity? Rescue? I closed the draft and instead opened a browser window. I typed ageism in America and began to read. Article after article, study after study, personal account after personal account, all describing variations of what I was experiencing. The statistics stunned me. Women over 50 were the fastest growing group facing housing insecurity. Age discrimination complaints had risen 47% in the past decade. Women's perceived market value in both professional and personal spheres began declining after 40, while men's continued to rise until 55. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't uniquely fragile or unusually sensitive. I was experiencing a documented societal phenomenon, one that affected millions of women. The realization was both validating and infuriating. I returned to my email and finished the message to Diane, not asking for anything but simply reconnecting, reminding her that I existed. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. 3 days later, I stood in the science museum surrounded by excited second graders. The teacher had assigned me to supervise a group of 6 children, including Aiden, as they explored the dinosaur exhibit. Melissa had been coolly civil when I left the house that morning, clearly still annoyed that I'd inserted myself into this event. But as I watched the children press their faces against the glass cases containing fossilized remains, their excitement was contagious. "Grandma, did you know the Tyrannosaurus Rex could bite with 8,000 pounds of force?" Aiden asked, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "I didn't know the exact number, but I knew it was impressive," I replied, genuinely enjoying his enthusiasm. "That's way stronger than a lion or anything alive today," he continued. "But they still went extinct. Mr. Phillips says that's because they couldn't adapt when the world changed too fast." The parallel struck me with unexpected force. Adapt, or go extinct. Was that what I was facing? Not physical extinction, but social extinction, the slow fading into irrelevance that seemed to be the fate of women past a certain age. "They didn't have any choice," I said to Aiden, "but we do. Humans can choose to adapt." Even as I said it, I wondered. Adapt to what? To being increasingly marginalized, to accepting invisibility as inevitable. As we moved through the exhibit, I noticed another chaperone, a woman roughly my age, with a stylish gray bob and bright red glasses. She caught my eye and smiled, a gesture of recognition I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. During the lunch break, she approached my table. "First time chaperoning?" she asked, sitting down beside me. "Yes. My grandson Aiden is in Mrs. Chen's class. I'm with my granddaughter Zoe. I'm Patricia, by the way." "Eleanor," I replied, oddly formal. "Eleanor Whitman." "The dinosaurs are always a hit," Patricia observed, watching the children devour their sandwiches with prehistoric enthusiasm. "Though it's a bit sobering to be surrounded by creatures that ruled the world for millions of years before vanishing into history." I laughed, surprised by how closely her thoughts mirrored my own. "I was just thinking something similar. About extinction and adaptation." "Oh, I'm all about adaptation," Patricia said, her eyes crinkling with humor behind her red frames. "My motto these days is adapt or raise hell, sometimes both simultaneously. I think I'm still figuring out which approach to take," I admitted. Patricia steadied me for a moment, her gaze direct and appraising in a way that made me want to both shrink back and stand taller. "You know, there's a group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. Women our age, talking about exactly these sorts of things. No agenda, no self-help nonsense, just honest conversation. You should come." I hesitated, automatically formulating an excuse. Thursday was when I usually prepared freezer meals for Mark's family for the upcoming week, a task Melissa had subtly suggested would be a helpful contribution to the household. "I don't know if I can," I began. "That's exactly why you should," Patricia interrupted, handing me a business card with her number scrawled on the back. 7 p.m. No pressure, but consider it. Sometimes it helps just to know you're not crazy for feeling what you're feeling. The children were gathering their lunch debris, signaling the end of the break. Patricia stood, squeezed my shoulder briefly, and returned to her group. I tucked the card into my pocket, oddly unsettled by the encounter. It had been so long since someone had seen me, truly seen me as a peer, as someone with thoughts worth engaging with. When I returned home that afternoon, I was surprised to find a response from Diane in my inbox. "Eleanor, so wonderful to hear from you. I've thought about you often and wondered how you were doing after Henry's passing. Are you still in the Boston area? I'm going to be there for it. Publishing conference next month. Would love to grab coffee and catch up properly." The email continued with updates about mutual friends and industry gossip, written in the warm, slightly acerbic tone I remembered well from our years working together. She ended with, "And if you're ever interested in dipping your toes back into the editorial waters, even on a freelance basis, I'd love to pick your brain about a few manuscripts that could use your touch. I read the email 3 times each. Reading producing a different emotion, nostalgia, then validation, then something approaching excitement. I hadn't thought about editing in months, had forced myself not to think about it, actually, as part of accepting my new circumscribed life. But Diane's casual mention cracked open a door I'd firmly shut, letting in a draft of possibility. That evening, as I chopped vegetables for dinner, Melissa entered the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "How was the field trip?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "It was fun," I replied, focusing on the precise dice of the carrots. "The kids loved the dinosaur exhibit. Aiden said you made a friend," she continued, reaching for a piece of bell pepper. "Another grandmother." I paused my chopping, struck by the slight emphasis on another, as if being a grandmother was now my primary identity, the category through which all interactions must be filtered. "Yes, Patricia. She invited me to a women's group that meets on Thursdays." Melissa raised her eyebrows. "What kind of group?" "Just a discussion group. For women, our age." I hesitated over the phrasing, not wanting to say older women or mature women, terms that seemed to come with built-in apologies. "That's nice," Melissa said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But Thursday is when you usually prep the freezer meals, isn't it? Mark and I rely on those for the busy weeknights." And there it was, the gentle reminder of my assigned utility, the subtle reinforcement of my place in their ecosystem. I resumed chopping, the knife hitting the cutting board with slightly more force than necessary. "I'm sure I can find time to do both," I said, not looking up. "Well, don't feel obligated. If you want to go to your senior group, we can always order takeout." The pause before senior stretched just long enough to sting. "It's good for you to have friends your own age." My own age. As if age was the only relevant characteristic for connection. As if my primary need was for an appropriate peer group rather than for meaningful engagement with the world. "It's not a senior group," I said quietly. "It's a women's discussion group." Melissa shrugged, already moving toward the doorway. "Whatever makes you happy, Eleanor." But that was precisely the question, wasn't it? What would make me happy? I'd spent so long adapting to others' needs, first to Henry's illness, then to Mark and Melissa's household, that I'd almost forgotten how to ask myself that question. The floral dress had been an attempt at an answer, but look how quickly that had been crushed. Still, something was stirring within me, something that had begun with that late-night writing session, and grown slightly stronger with each small act of self-assertion since on Thursday evening, I found myself standing outside the community center, Patricia's business card clutched in my hand. I'd spent the afternoon preparing the usual freezer meals, working with ruthless efficiency to finish by 6:30. I'd left a note on the kitchen counter, explaining where I'd gone, not asking permission, not apologizing, simply informing. Now, as I approached the entrance, I felt a fluttering nervousness I hadn't experienced in years. The meeting room was easy to find, marked by a simple sign, "Women's Forum, all welcome." I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene, about 15 women seated in a rough circle, some with gray hair, others dyed vibrant colors, ranging in age from perhaps 52 well into their 70s. Their attire varied from casual jeans to elegant pantsuits, from sensible flats to statement jewelry. The energy in the room was palpable. Animated conversations, frequent laughter, gestures of emphasis and agreement. Patricia spotted me from across the room and waved me over, patting an empty chair beside her. As I made my way through the circle, I felt oddly exposed, certain I was being evaluated and found wanting. But the faces that turned toward me showed only polite interest or welcoming smiles. "Everyone, this is Eleanor," Patricia announced as I sat down. She was brave enough to join us after just one conversation. "Eleanor, we're just getting started. Tonight's topic is the invisibility switch. When did you first notice?" A collective murmur of recognition rippled through the group. A woman with a sleek silver pixie cut and elegant turquoise earrings spoke first. "I'm Vivian. For me, it was at my nephew's wedding 3 years ago. I'd just turned 58, was wearing a dress I loved, feeling good. The photographer was arranging people for family photos and looked right through me, literally asked if I was with the bride or groom's side while I was standing next to my brother, the father of the groom. When I said I was the groom's aunt, he looked surprised and said, "Oh, I thought you were one of the plus ones," as if I couldn't possibly be part of the family's actual story. Nods around the circle, sounds of recognition. "Mine was at work," said another woman, her southern accent warm but her eyes hard. "Engineering firm, I'd been there 18 years. New CEO comes in, 40-something man starts having these innovation strategy sessions, invites the entire department except me. When I asked why, my supervisor said, and I quote, 'We thought you'd be uncomfortable with all the new technology talk.' I had 3 patents with that company." 3 more nods. A woman with henna-red hair and chunky amber jewelry leaned forward. "Divorce, for me. 29 years of marriage. Then David decides he wants one more adventure before he's too old." Translation: 26-year-old yoga instructor. In court, his lawyer actually argued that at 57, I had less need for ongoing support because, and again I quote, "women of her age have modest lifestyle requirements," as if aging meant I should expect less of everything, less money, less consideration, less life. The stories continued around the circle, moments of dismissal, erasure, casual cruelty. Some involved family members, others strangers or colleagues. Some were dramatic confrontations, others quiet realizations. But all shared the same core, the bewildering experience of being reclassified from person to irrelevance, without consent or warning. When the circle reached me, I hesitated. These women were strangers, yet they had shared vulnerable truths without hedging. The least I could do was offer the same honesty. "My daughter-in-law," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. 3 days ago, I put on a new dress, floral, colorful, and she looked at me and said, "Don't wear that outfit. You look like a ridiculous old woman." I heard several sharp intakes of breath, saw Patricia's hand clench slightly on her armrest. In front of my son, I continued, who said nothing, just pretended to be absorbed in his phone. I felt like I'd been caught doing something shameful, like trying to look attractive at my age was somehow delusional or pathetic. "What did you do?" asked a woman across the circle. I changed into something appropriate, I admitted. "A navy pantsuit I've had for years, something invisible." "We all do it," said Vivian with the turquoise earrings. "Capitulate, go along. It seems easier in the moment, but it costs us," added the Southern engineer. "Every time we shrink to make others comfortable, we lose a piece of ourselves." "What would you have wanted to do?" Patricia asked me directly, her red glasses glinting in the fluorescent light. The question caught me off guard. What would I have wanted to do? Not what I should have done, not what a stronger person might have done, but what I, Eleanor Whitman, would have wanted in that moment. I would have wanted to say that her opinion wasn't the only one that mattered. I said slowly, discovering the truth as I spoke it. That I liked how I looked in that dress. That calling someone ridiculous and old as if they're synonyms is cruel and small-minded. My voice grew stronger. I would have wanted my son to defend me, or at least acknowledge the hurt. I would have wanted to wear the dress anyway. Patricia nodded, satisfied. That's where we start, not with what we did, but with what we wanted to do. Next time, maybe the gap between those things will be smaller. The discussion shifted then, from recognition of the problem to strategies for resistance. Some were internal practices of self-validation, methods for maintaining confidence. Others were external specific phrases to use when confronted with ageism. Ways to assert presence in professional or social settings. Legal resources when discrimination crossed into actionable territory. As I listened, I felt something expanding inside me, a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in months, perhaps years. These women refused to accept their gradual erasure as inevitable. They were angry, yes, but their anger was fuel. Rather than fire, driving them toward purposeful action rather than consuming them in bitterness. By the time the meeting ended at 9 p.m., I had filled 3 pages in the small notebook I carried with insights and resources. Patricia introduced me to several other members, including Vivian, who mentioned she led writing workshops at the library on Tuesday mornings. Nothing fancy, she explained, just a space for women to tell their stories. You mentioned you worked in publishing. We'd love to have someone with your experience. The casual acknowledgement of my professional background, the assumption that it still mattered, still formed part of who I was, felt like a cool drink after a long thirst. I'll think about it, I promised, and meant it. On the drive home, my mind was so full of new thoughts that I almost missed the turn onto Mark and Melissa's street. Their street, not mine, I reminded myself. I had been living in their home for 18 months, but had never claimed it as my own. Perhaps that needed to change, not the physical space, but my occupation of it. The house was quiet when I entered. The kitchen light left on, but the rest of the room's dark. A note sat on the counter next to an empty takeout container. Hope your meeting was good. We ate Thai. No mention of the missing freezer meals. No passive-aggressive reminder of my abandoned duties. A small relief. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen island, reviewing the evening in my mind. The women's stories had resonated so deeply because they articulated experiences I'd had but never named. The casual dismissals, the gradual exclusion, the subtle message that my continued presence in the world required justification. But something else had happened in that circle of women, something beyond validation of shared grievance. I had glimpsed versions of my future self that had nothing to do with fading gracefully into the background. Vivian, with her writing workshop. Patricia with her advocacy work. The former engineer who now consulted on age discrimination cases. The divorced woman who had started a travel company specifically for single women over 50. They had refused the narrative of diminishment, had instead claimed new territories for themselves. I opened my laptop and returned to the document I'd started 3 nights earlier. Invisible. The title still declared, but that no longer felt quite right. I positioned my cursor and added a question mark. Invisible. Now, it was a query rather than a statement, a hypothesis to be tested rather than a fate to be accepted. I began to write again, not about hurt this time, but about possibility. About the gap between what I had done and what I had wanted to do, and how I might begin to close that distance. About the women I had met and the stories they had told. About the parts of myself I had packed away, my professional identity, my creative voice, my right to take up space, unapologetically. I wrote until midnight, the words coming easily now, without the desperate edge of that first night. When I finally closed the laptop, I felt tired, but clear, as if a fever had broken. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly. A first step away from invisibility. The next morning, I woke early and opened my closet. The navy pantsuit hung there, reliable and unremarkable. Beside it, crumpled slightly from being hastily rehung, was the floral dress that had provoked Melissa's comment. I removed it from the hanger and spread it on the bed, studying it objectively. It was colorful. Yes, a pattern of deep blues and purples against a cream background. The cut was fitted but not tight, with a modest neckline and a hem that fell just below the knee. There was nothing inherently age-inappropriate about it. It simply wasn't beige or navy or gray. It wasn't invisible. I put on the dress, added simple pearl earrings and low heels, and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. Mark was already there, coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone at the counter. He glanced up as I entered, did a slight double take at the dress, then quickly composed his features. "Morning, Mom. You're up early. Good morning. I thought I'd make blueberry pancakes for the kids. Special Friday treat." He nodded, returning to his phone. I began gathering ingredients, hyper-aware of the rustle of the dress fabric, as I moved around the kitchen, feeling simultaneously defiant and ridiculous. A ridiculous old woman. The phrase echoed in my head, but this morning it had less power. It was just words, hurtful, thoughtless words from someone whose opinion didn't have to define my reality. Melissa entered as I was measuring flour, dressed for her part-time job at the children's boutique downtown. She stopped short when she saw me, her eyes going immediately to the dress. "Oh," she said. the single syllable conveying volumes. You're wearing that again. I continued measuring, my hands. Steady, yes, I am. I thought, double quotes. She began, then recalibrated. Did you have a good time at your meeting last night? I did. Thank you for asking. I cracked an egg into the bowl, my movements deliberate. It was interesting to talk with other women who are navigating this phase of life. I'm going back next Thursday. Mark looked up from his phone. Next Thursday too. Is this going to be a regular thing? The question was innocuous enough, but I heard the undercurrent. Would this disrupt the household routine they had come to expect from me? Would this inconvenience them in some way? Yes, I think it will be. I'll still prepare the freezer meals, but they'll be ready by Thursday afternoon instead of evening. I didn't frame it as a question or a request. For the first time since moving in with them, I was simply informing them of my plans rather than seeking approval. A beat of silence, then Melissa shrugged. Whatever works for you, Eleanor. The children burst into the kitchen. Then Aiden chattering about a science project, and Emma demanding her favorite cup for juice. The moment of tension dissipated in the flurry of morning routines. As I flipped pancakes and poured juice, I felt a curious lightness. I had worn the dress, stated my intention to continue attending the group, and the world hadn't ended. A small victory, perhaps, but mine. After everyone left for the day, I opened my laptop again and found the email from Diane. I reread her casual mention of freelance editing, allowing myself to consider the possibility. I had left my career to care for Henry, a choice I didn't regret for a moment. But he had been gone for over 2 years now, and I had automatically assumed that chapter of my life was permanently closed. What if it wasn't? I began to draft a response, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. Yes, I would love to meet when she was in Boston next month. Yes, I might be interested in some freelance work, depending on the projects. I had expertise and perspective to offer. My professional value hadn't evaporated along with my youth. As I was about to hit send, a new email notification appeared, a message from Patricia with the subject line, "Resources from last night." I opened it to find links to articles, book recommendations, and a reminder about next week's meeting. But it was the postscript that caught my attention. Vivian mentioned you might be interested in her writing workshop. The next session starts Tuesday at 10 a.m. at the main library branch. No pressure, but she'd love to have you. I added the information to my calendar, then returned to the email to Diane and hit send. 2 small actions that felt strangely momentous, reaching backward toward a self I had been, and forward toward a self I might become. The weekend passed quietly. Mark was preparing for a big case, sequestered in his home office for hours. Melissa took the children to her parents' house for Sunday dinner, an event to which I was never invited, though no one explicitly said it was because her parents found me depressing since Henry's death. I used the time alone to research age discrimination laws and resources, bookmarking articles and making notes. I was beginning to understand that what I had experienced wasn't unique or personal. It was systemic, documented, and, importantly, something that could be recognized and named. On Tuesday morning, I drove to the library for Vivian's writing workshop. The meeting room was smaller than the one at the community center, with just 8 women gathered around a table strewn with notebooks and pens. Vivian greeted me warmly, her turquoise earrings today replaced with amber ones that caught the light as she moved. "I'm so glad you came," she said, gesturing me to an empty chair. "We're just about to start. The theme today is the stories we tell ourselves." For the next 2 hours, I wrote more than I had in years, not the private journaling of recent days, but structured reflections guided by Vivian's thoughtful prompts. We wrote about narratives we had internalized, about moments when we had accepted others' definitions of us, about alternative stories we might choose to believe instead. When it was time to share, I hesitated, then read aloud a paragraph about the floral dress incident. I described not just Melissa's comment and my hurt, but the decision to wear the dress again, the subtle shift in how I viewed myself in it. As I finished reading, I looked up to find 7 pairs of eyes fixed on me, with expressions of recognition and respect. "That's exactly what we're talking about," Vivian said, choosing a different narrative, not accepting the role of invisible grandmother who should only wear beige and be grateful for whatever space she's allowed to occupy. "I'm still living in their house, though," I pointed out. "There are practical limitations to how much I can push back, for now," said a woman across the table whom I hadn't met before. She introduced herself as Helen, a retired attorney. "But that's a circumstance, not a permanent state. Have you considered other living arrangements?" I blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. "Not really. After Henry died, it seemed simpler to accept Mark and Melissa's offer. My old job was gone. The house was too big for just me, ... But that was then," Helen said. "What about now? What about now?" The question lingered as I drove home, as I prepared dinner, as I helped Aiden with his homework. What about now? My circumstances had seemed fixed, my trajectory set. But was that true, or just another story I had been telling myself? That evening, after the children were in bed, I heard Mark and Melissa talking in low voices in the living room. I was passing by on my way to the kitchen when I caught my name. I paused, knowing I shouldn't eavesdrop, but unable to move away. "I'm just saying she seems different lately," Melissa was saying. "The dress thing. These new groups she's going to. It's like she's having some kind of midlife crisis." Mark's laugh was short. "At her age, it would be more of a late-life crisis. But I know what you mean. Mom's always been so ... accommodating. This new assertiveness is strange." "It's not just assertiveness," Melissa continued. "She's questioning things she used to just accept, like last night when I mentioned the Richardsons' anniversary party being adults only, and she asked why she wasn't considered adult enough to receive her own invitation instead of being lumped in with us. She has been a little prickly," Mark admitted. "Maybe it's just a phase. She's probably still adjusting to life without Dad. It can't be easy starting over at her age." At her age. The phrase again, the casual assumption of limitation, of diminished possibility. I continued to the kitchen, no longer hungry but needing to move, to put distance between myself and their conversation. Their words shouldn't have surprised me. I had lived with Mark and Melissa long enough to understand how they viewed me, and yet hearing it stated so plainly still stung. But beneath the hurt was something new, a spark of anger that felt clean and clarifying. They saw my emerging self-advocacy as a problem, a disruption to their comfortable arrangement. Perhaps it was. Perhaps that was necessary. Back in my room, I opened my laptop and began researching apartment rentals in the area. The costs were high. Boston had never been an affordable city, but not impossible. I still had savings from the sale of our house, carefully invested. I had Social Security and Henry's pension. And if I could secure some freelance editing work through Diane... I created a spreadsheet and began calculating, the familiar process of working with concrete numbers, soothing my agitation. By midnight, I had determined that a modest one-bedroom apartment within a reasonable distance would be financially feasible, especially if I could count on even part-time income. It would require careful budgeting, but it was possible. More than possible, it was viable. I saved the spreadsheet and closed my laptop, a plan beginning to take shape in my mind. I wouldn't make any hasty announcements or dramatic exits. I would move methodically, building the foundation for independence first. The writing workshop, the women's group, the potential freelance work, these weren't just activities. They were steps toward reclaiming a self that could exist independently of my role as Mark's mother or Aiden and Emma's grandmother. The next morning, an email from Diane was waiting in my inbox. She had a manuscript she thought would be perfect for me to work on, a memoir by a woman in her 60s reflecting on her career in journalism. The writing is strong but needs tightening, and the author specifically requested an editor who would understand her perspective. $3,500 for a comprehensive edit, with the possibility of more projects if this goes well. Interested? I stared at the figure, $3,500. Not an enormous sum, but significant. More importantly, it was compensation for my expertise, recognition of my professional value. I replied immediately, definitely interested. Please send the manuscript and timeline. That afternoon, I received notification that I had been approved as a volunteer chaperone for Aiden's upcoming field trip to the aquarium. I made a note on the kitchen calendar, not asking if it would interfere with any of Melissa's plans, simply claiming the day. Small steps, each one building on the last. I wasn't naive enough to think the path would be smooth, or that my newfound resolve wouldn't waver. But for the first time since Henry's death, perhaps for the first time since years before that, if I was truly honest with myself, I was moving toward something rather than away from loss. Thursday evening found me back at the community center for the women's group. The topic this week was reclaiming space. Physical, financial, emotional. As the discussion unfolded, I shared my preliminary research into independent living, my calculations, my tentative timeline. I haven't told my son yet, I admitted. I'm still gathering information, making sure it's viable before I announce anything. Smart, said Helen, the retired attorney. Get your ducks in a row first. People are less likely to try to talk you out of something when you present it as a well-researched plan, rather than a vague idea. Are you worried about their reaction? Patricia asked. I considered the question. Yes and no. Mark will be concerned about my being alone, about whether I can manage financially. Melissa, I paused, choosing my words carefully. Melissa might actually be relieved. I think my increasing assertiveness has been uncomfortable for her. She preferred me as the grateful, accommodating mother-in-law. And how do you feel about the prospect of living alone? Asked a woman named Ruth whom I'd met the previous week, another careful consideration. Nervous, I admitted, but also, excited. I keep thinking about small things, arranging furniture exactly as I want it, not having to consider anyone else's preferences for dinner, wearing whatever I please without commentary. It's been so long since I've had that kind of autonomy. The conversation shifted to practical advice, neighborhoods to consider, resources for single women, security measures for living alone. I took notes diligently, the plan becoming more concrete with each suggestion. By the time the meeting ended, what had been a tentative idea had solidified into a clear intention. On my drive home, my phone rang, the hands-free system displaying Diane's number on the dashboard screen. I answered, curious about the evening call. Eleanor, hope it's not too late to call, but I just had a conversation that might interest you. Remember James Harrington from Pearson? James had been a colleague years ago, a respected editor who had moved up the corporate ladder to become a publishing executive. Of course. Is he still at Pearson? No. He started his own boutique publishing house 3 years ago, Meridian Press. They specialize in books for the over 50 demographic, both fiction and nonfiction. Anyway, I mentioned to him that you might be available for freelance work, and he practically jumped through the phone. Said they're desperately looking for editors who actually understand their target audience rather than 20-somethings trying to imagine what old people want to read. I laughed despite myself at her blunt phrasing. And he wants to talk to you. Not just about freelance editing. He mentioned they're looking for a part-time acquisitions editor. Someone who could work remotely with occasional trips to their office in Providence. It would be 15 to 20 hours a week, focusing on identifying and developing new titles for their women's interest imprint. The opportunity was so perfectly aligned with my emerging plan that it momentarily took my breath away. Part-time, remote work in a field I knew well, focused on an audience I understood intimately. It was as if the universe was confirming the path I had just committed to following. I'm definitely interested, I said, hearing the excitement in my own voice. When can we talk? He suggested a video call tomorrow at 11 a.m. Does that work for you? Tomorrow was Friday. I usually watched Emma in the morning while Melissa was at the boutique. Let me call you back in 15 minutes, I said, making a quick decision. I need to check something, but I think I can make it work. When I arrived home, the house was quiet except for the murmur of the television in the master bedroom. I knocked softly on Mark and Melissa's door, waiting for their acknowledgement before opening it slightly. Sorry to interrupt, I said. But I wanted to let you know I have a business call tomorrow at 11. It should only last about an hour, but it means I won't be able to watch Emma during that time." Mark looked up from his laptop, surprise evident on his face. "A business call? What kind of business?" "A potential editing job," I replied, keeping my tone matter-of-fact. "A publisher I used to work with is looking for someone with my experience." Melissa muted the television. "But you watch Emma on Fridays." "I have my shift at Petty Chic. I understand that's been the arrangement, but I need to take this call. Perhaps Mark could work from home for an hour, or Emma could come to the store with you just this once." I saw them exchange glances, the silent communication of a couple confronted with an unexpected disruption. I waited, not offering alternatives or apologies, simply stating my need and leaving them to adjust around it. "I guess she could come to the store," Melissa finally said, her tone suggesting this was a major concession. "But I wish we'd had more notice. I just received the call myself," I explained. "I wanted to let you know as soon as possible. I didn't add that in their household." Plans changed frequently to accommodate Mark's work emergencies or Melissa's social commitments, often with less notice than I was providing. "What kind of editing job is this?" Mark asked, his expression hovering between concern and curiosity. "It's a publishing house that specializes in books for mature readers. They're looking for someone with experience in acquisitions and development." I didn't elaborate further, not yet ready to share the full scope of what this opportunity might mean. "Well, good luck with it," he said, his tone suggesting he saw it as a hobby rather than a serious professional prospect. "Thank you," I replied simply, then closed their door and returned to my room to call Diane back and confirm the appointment. The interview the next day exceeded my expectations. James Harrington remembered me well from our Pearson days and was genuinely enthusiastic about the perspective I could bring to Meridian Press. "Our whole mission is to publish books that speak to people in the prime of their lives, not as an afterthought or a niche market, but as the valuable, vibrant demographic they are," he explained. "We need editors who don't see age as a limitation but as a different kind of opportunity." By the end of our hour-long conversation, he had offered me a 3-month trial period as a remote acquisitions consultant, with the possibility of a permanent, part-time position if things went well. The compensation was fair, $32 per hour for 15 to 20 hours per week, plus bonuses for any titles I brought in that were ultimately published. I would need to visit their Providence office once a month for in-person meetings, but otherwise could work entirely from home. I accepted on the spot, a surge of professional confidence returning as we discussed start dates and paperwork. When the call ended, I sat at my desk for several minutes, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. After 2 years of professional dormancy, I was re-entering the work world, not as a favor or a token hire, but because my experience and perspective were genuinely valued. The realization firmed my resolve about the apartment search. With this income combined with my existing resources, independence was not just possible, but practical. That afternoon, while Melissa was picking up the children from school, I made appointments to view 3 apartments the following week. The momentum was building now, each step making the next one easier. On Tuesday, I returned to Vivian's writing workshop and shared my progress. The group's support was immediate and practical. One woman knew of a building with reasonable rents for seniors. Another recommended a moving company that offered discounts through AARP. A third suggested furniture consignment shops, where I could find pieces to supplement what little I would take from Mark and Melissa's. At Thursday's community center meeting, Patricia introduced me to a financial advisor who specialized in working with women over 50, particularly those navigating major life transitions. "The first consultation is free," she explained, "and Judith has a sliding scale for ongoing services. She helped me reorganize my finances after my divorce, and I swear she found money I didn't even know I had." I made an appointment with Judith for the following week, adding it to my increasingly full calendar. Between the apartment viewings, the writing workshop, the women's group, my new work with Meridian Press, and my regular commitments to Mark's family, My days were now structured around my own priorities rather than solely around others' needs. This shift did not go unnoticed. The following Sunday, as I was preparing to leave for a coffee meeting with Vivian to discuss a writing project, Mark intercepted me in the hallway. "Mom, do you have a minute? I wanted to talk to you about something." I glanced at my watch. I had planned my departure to allow plenty of time to reach the cafe, but I could spare a few minutes. "Of course. What is it?" He gestured toward the living room, where Melissa sat primly on the edge of the sofa, her posture suggesting this was a planned intervention, rather than a casual chat. I followed him, a familiar flutter of anxiety in my stomach, the reflexive response of someone accustomed to prioritizing others' comfort above her own needs. "We've noticed you've been really busy lately," Mark began once we were seated. "These groups you're attending, the editing work, all these appointments, double quotes. Yes. It's been a full few weeks," I agreed, keeping my tone neutral. "We're just a little concerned," Melissa interjected. "It seems like a lot all at once. We wonder if maybe you're overextending yourself." The subtext was clear. "You're disrupting our routine. Your independence is inconvenient for us." I took a deep breath, centering myself. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing my time well. In fact, I've been feeling more energized than I have in quite some time." Mark leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's good to hear, Mom. But you know, after Dad died, the grief counselor mentioned that sometimes people go through phases where they try to fill the void with activities. We just want to make sure you're not pushing yourself too hard to escape the grief." The armchair I sat in suddenly felt like a witness stand, my son and daughter-in-law positioned as both prosecutors and jury. They had constructed a narrative, the fragile widow in denial, the grieving mother seeking distraction, that neatly explained away my emerging independence as pathology rather than growth. "I appreciate that perspective," I said carefully, "but I don't think that's what's happening. Yes, I miss your father every day. But it's been more than 2 years, and I'm discovering that I still have a lot to contribute and experience. The editing work, the writing group, these aren't distractions. They're meaningful engagements with parts of myself that got set aside during your father's illness and after his death." Melissa's smile was tight. "Of course, Eleanor, no one's saying you can't have hobbies. We just want to make sure you're not taking on too much. After all, we rely on you here too, with the children and the household." There it was, the crux of their concern. Not my well-being, but my utility to them. I felt a flash of clarity so sharp it was almost painful. They had never seen me as a whole person with my own needs and aspirations. I was a resource, a convenience, defined by what I could provide rather than who I was. "I understand that," I replied, maintaining my composure. "And I've been careful to fulfill all my commitments to you and the children. But I also need to fulfill some commitments to myself." Mark frowned slightly. "What does that mean, exactly?" This was the opening I hadn't planned for, the moment to reveal my intentions before I had all the pieces in place. But perhaps it was better this way, to set the stage gradually rather than presenting them with a fait accompli. "It means I'm considering some changes," I said, choosing my words with care. "I'm exploring the possibility of finding my own place again, now that I have this editing work and some other opportunities developing." The stunned silence that followed was almost comical, both of them frozen in identical expressions of disbelief, as if I had announced plans to journey to the moon. "Your own place," Melissa finally echoed. "You mean ... move out, live alone?" "Eventually, yes. I've been researching apartments in the area, calculating finances. With the editing income and my savings, it's quite feasible." Mark's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Mom, that seems extreme. If you're feeling cramped here, we could discuss converting the den into a more private space for you. Or it's not about space, Mark," I interrupted gently. "It's about independence, about creating a life that's my own again." "But you're 55, he protested, as if the number itself was an insurmountable obstacle. "Starting over at your age 55 is not ancient," I said. edge entering my voice, despite my efforts at patience. Many women my age are at the peak of their careers, traveling the world, starting businesses. I'm not starting over, I'm continuing. There was a life before I moved in here, and there will be a life after. Melissa stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt with jerky movements. Well, if you've already decided, I don't see what there is to discuss. Of course you're free to do whatever you think is best. Her tone suggested exactly the opposite, that I was being selfish, unreasonable, abandoning my proper role. I haven't made any final decisions yet, I clarified, unwilling to let her frame my exploration as a betrayal. I'm researching options, that's all. I wanted to be transparent about what I'm considering. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it momentarily caught my heart. Let's all take some time to think about this, okay? It's a big change to consider. Maybe we can talk more next weekend when things aren't so rushed. I nodded, recognizing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion for now. That sounds reasonable. And I should get going. I'm meeting Vivian to discuss a project. I stood, gathering my purse and car keys. A project? Mark asked, still struggling to absorb the series of revelations. What kind of project? I paused at the doorway, allowing myself a small smile. A writing project, about women reclaiming their visibility after 50. It's still in the early stages, but Vivian thinks it has potential. I left them sitting there, their expressions a mixture of confusion and consternation. As I drove to the cafe, I felt a curious lightness, despite the tension of the conversation. The truth was out now, not fully formed, but the seed of it planted. Whatever resistance I encountered, I had taken another step toward reclaiming my life. Vivian was already at the cafe when I arrived, a pot of tea and 2 cups waiting on the table. You look like you've been through something, she observed as I sat down. Everything okay? I just told my son and daughter-in-law that I'm considering moving out, I replied, pouring tea with a slightly unsteady hand. It wasn't exactly planned, but the moment presented itself. And how did they take it? About as well as you'd expect. Shock, concern about my ability to manage on my own, thinly veiled annoyance at the inconvenience to them. Vivian nodded, unsurprised. The classic response. When we stay small and accommodating, we're praised for being good sports about aging. The moment we assert our continued right to a full life, we're either delusional or selfish. Exactly. Mark actually said, but you're as if that number alone should limit what I might aspire to. And what did you say to that? I smiled, remembering the moment clarity had cut through my usual conflict aversion. I told him 55 isn't ancient, and that many women my age are at the peak of their careers or starting new ventures. That I'm not starting over. I'm continuing. Beautifully put, Vivian approved, raising her teacup in a small toast. And perfect for the opening chapter of our book. The project we'd been discussing was evolving from idea to action, a collection of essays by women over 50 about moments of reclamation and reinvention. Vivian, who had published 2 poetry collections, had connections with a small feminist press that had expressed interest in the concept. My editing background made me a natural partner in shaping the manuscript. I've been thinking about the structure, I said, pulling out my notebook. Instead of organizing it chronologically or thematically, what if we arranged the essays as responses to the dismissive phrases women our age commonly hear? But you're 55, at your age, women like you, that sort of thing. Turning the weapons back on themselves, Vivian mused, eyes brightening. I love that approach. Each phrase becomes a chapter heading, and the essays that follow deconstruct and challenge the assumption embedded in it. We spent the next 2 hours outlining the concept, drafting a proposal for the publisher, and identifying potential contributors from the women's group and beyond. The creative energy between us was invigorating. The familiar flow of ideas building and refining. The satisfaction of crafting something with purpose and structure. You know, Vivian said as we were gathering our things to leave, when you first came to the writing workshop, you were still half invisible to yourself as much as to others. Now look at you. Planning a book, reclaiming your career, preparing for independence. It's remarkable what can happen in just a few weeks when we decide to take up space again. Her observation startled me with its accuracy. It had been only 23 days since Melissa's comment about the floral dress, yet the trajectory of my life had shifted dramatically in that short time. Not because of magical transformation, but because of deliberate choices, each small decision to assert myself, to reconnect with dormant aspects of my identity, to refuse the narrative of irrelevance. The following week unfolded with purposeful momentum. I viewed 3 apartments, finding one that felt immediately right, a 1-bedroom in a quiet building with large windows and a small balcony. Within my budget and only 15 minutes from Mark's house, so I could still see the children regularly. The leasing agent, herself a woman in her 60s, was refreshingly matter-of-fact about my situation. "We get a lot of women your age starting fresh," she told me. "Divorces, widowhood, empty nests. Life keeps changing, and so do living arrangements. This building has good security and a mix of ages, but a strong contingent of independent women over 50. There's even an informal social group that meets in the community room on Friday evenings." I put in an application, providing my newly signed contract with Meridian Press as proof of income along with my financial statements. My meeting with Judith, the financial advisor Patricia had recommended, confirmed what my own calculations had suggested. With careful budgeting and the part-time income, I could maintain a comfortable independent life. "You're actually in a better position than many women I counsel," Judith noted, reviewing my documents. "You have savings, your husband's pension, your own Social Security benefits, and now this new income stream. Plus, you're re-establishing your professional identity, which has value beyond the immediate financial impact." At Thursday's women's group, I shared my progress and received both congratulations and practical advice about everything from negotiating lease terms to finding reliable maintenance services. The circle had become a crucial support system, a place where my steps toward independence were celebrated rather than questioned. That weekend, as promised, Mark initiated another conversation about my plans. This time, the tone was different, less intervention, more genuine dialogue. We sat in the backyard while Melissa took the children to a birthday party. The October afternoon unusually warm. "So you're serious about this moving plan?" he began, no question in his voice. "Yes, I am. In fact, I've found an apartment I like and submitted an application. If it's approved, I could move in next month." He nodded slowly, processing the information. "That's faster than I expected. Are you sure about the timing? Winter's coming, and moving in the cold." "The timing feels right to me," I said gently. "I've thought this through carefully, Mark. It's not an impulsive decision. I know that. I just ... double quotes." He paused, searching for words. "When Dad died, I wanted to make sure you were taken care of, that you weren't alone. The idea of you living by yourself again, at your..." He caught himself, remembering our previous conversation. "I mean, after everything you've been through, it worries me." I reached over and took his hand, touched by the genuine concern beneath the reflexive paternalism. "I understand that, and I appreciate how much you care. But taking care of me doesn't have to mean having me live here. It can mean supporting my choices, checking in regularly, still being part of each other's lives in meaningful ways. And the kids, they're used to having you here. The apartment is 15 minutes away. I can still pick them up from school sometimes, still have them for overnights occasionally. We'll adjust. Children are adaptable, and it's actually good for them to see their grandmother as a whole person with her own life, not just as an extension of their family unit." He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when Dad was sick, you were so focused on him, we all were. And then after, you seemed, I don't know, diminished somehow. Like a part of you had gone with him. I got used to thinking of you as needing protection." The observation was surprisingly insightful, cutting closer to truth than I had expected from my pragmatic son. "I was diminished," I acknowledged. "Grief does that. And it was easier, in some ways, to shrink myself to fit into your household, than to figure out who I was without your father. But that phase has passed. I'm ready to expand again, to discover what comes next. And this editing job, the writing project, those are part of it. They're part of it. So are the women I've met who are going through similar transitions. So is the simple act of making decisions based on what I want rather than what's expected of me. Mark sighed. But it wasn't an exhalation of frustration, more like the release of a tension he had been carrying. Melissa's not thrilled, you know. She's gotten used to having built-in childcare and household help. I appreciated his honesty. The acknowledgement of what we both knew but had left unspoken. I understand that. Change is difficult, and your family routine will need to adjust. But Melissa is resourceful, and there are many childcare options available. This isn't a rejection of you or the children. It's an affirmation of myself. When you put it that way, it's hard to argue, he admitted with a small smile. Dad would be proud of you, you know. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, even though you never made a big show of it. The mention of Henry's perspective caught me off guard. A warm ache spreading through my chest. Thank you for saying that. I think he would understand what I'm doing now. He never wanted me to disappear after he was gone. As Mark and I continued talking, I felt a shift in our relationship, a recalibration from mother-son to two adults with separate but connected lives. He asked thoughtful questions about my plans, offered genuine assistance with the practical aspects of moving, and even suggested he could help set up my new internet service, since tech stuff can be confusing. I let the mild ageism in that last comment pass, recognizing that change happens in stages. The important thing was that he was beginning to see me as a person making legitimate choices, rather than as an aging parent needing direction. The lease approval came through 3 days later. I could move in on November 15th, giving me just over 3 weeks to prepare. The timeline felt simultaneously too fast and not fast enough. Now that the decision was made, I was eager to begin this new chapter, to wake up in a space that was entirely my own. I began sorting through my belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The process was both practical and symbolic, choosing which artifacts of my past would accompany me into my future, which had served their purpose and could be released. I worked methodically, room by room, creating inventories and packing boxes in the afternoons while Mark was at work and the children at school. Melissa maintained a cool distance during this period, her interactions with me polite but minimal. I understood her resistance. My departure would disrupt her carefully managed household system and remove a reliable source of unpaid labor. But beneath her coolness, I occasionally caught glimpses of something else, a reluctant respect, perhaps, or simply the resignation of someone accepting an inevitable change. One evening, as I was labeling a box of books in my room, there was a soft knock at the door. I opened it to find Emma, her 4-year-old face solemn beneath tousled hair. "Grandma, are you going away forever?" she asked, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. I knelt down to her level, my knees protesting slightly at the movement. "No, sweetheart. I'm moving to my own apartment, but it's very close by. You can come visit me there, and I'll still see you lots of times." "Mommy said you're leaving because you don't want to live with us anymore." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "Is it because I'm too noisy?" The innocent question revealed the adult conversations she had overheard, the way my decision had been framed to her. I felt a flash of anger toward Melissa for putting that burden of guilt on a child, but kept my voice gentle. "That's not it at all. I love living with you and hearing all your wonderful noise. But grandmas are people too, with their own lives to live. Sometimes we need our own space. Just like you need your own room instead of sharing with Aiden. It doesn't mean I love you any less, or want to see you any less." She considered this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Will you have cookies at your apartment? And can I have a special chair there like I have here?" I smiled, relieved by the practical turn of her concerns. "Absolutely. In fact, maybe you can help me pick out a special chair just for you. And we'll always keep cookies for when you visit." This seemed to satisfy her. She nodded solemnly, then threw her arms around my neck in a fierce hug before running back to the hallway. I rose slowly, my heart full but heavy. The children would adjust. Children always did, but these moments of transition were never without cost. As the moving date approached, I found myself increasingly busy with both practical preparations and my expanding professional commitments. The manuscript Diane had sent for editing was now complete, and she had already forwarded another project. My work with Meridian Press was going well. I had identified 2 promising submissions for their consideration, and was developing relationships with literary agents who represented authors in our demographic. The writing project with Vivian had evolved into a formal book proposal titled Reclaiming Visibility: Women's Essays on Aging Without Disappearing. We had secured commitments from 12 contributors, including Helen, Patricia, and several other women from our community group, each addressing a different aspect of claiming space and voice after 50. Throughout this whirlwind of activity, I continued to attend the Thursday Women's Group, which had become an anchor in my week, a place where my experiences were understood without explanation, where my growth was celebrated without qualification. On my last Thursday before the move, the group surprised me with a housewarming gift, a beautiful stained glass lamp in jewel tones of purple, blue, and amber. "For your new living room," Patricia explained as I unwrapped it. "So that every evening, you're surrounded by light and color. No beige, no invisibility." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved me deeply. These women, many of whom I had known for less than 2 months, had seen me more clearly than people who had been in my life for years. They had recognized my journey because they were on similar paths themselves, navigating the complicated terrain of reinvention after decades of being defined primarily through relationships to others. Moving day itself was efficiently orchestrated, thanks to the support system I had built. Mark took the day off work to help, bringing a colleague's pickup truck for the larger items. Vivian and Patricia arrived with coffee and pastries, directing the moving company workers with good-humored authority. Helen stopped by in the afternoon to help unpack the kitchen, insisting that having the coffee maker and wine glasses accessible on the first night is non-negotiable. By evening, the apartment was taking shape, not fully unpacked, but functional and already beginning to feel like mine. The stained glass lamp glowed in the corner of the living room, casting warm-colored light across the space. I had brought relatively little furniture from Mark and Melissa's, preferring to select new pieces that reflected my current taste, rather than carrying forward items chosen for their practicality in a family setting. After everyone had gone, I stood in the center of the living room, absorbing the silence. It was not the hollow silence of loneliness, but the peaceful silence of sovereignty, a space entirely under my control, arranged according to my preferences, governed by my rhythms alone. I felt a deep exhale, as if I had been holding my breath slightly for the past 18 months without realizing it. That night, I slept in my new bedroom, in a bed positioned exactly as I wanted it, with windows uncovered to let in the night sky. I woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented, then increasingly delighted, as consciousness returned and I remembered where I was, my place, my life, my choices. The first weeks of independence unfolded with a mixture of practical adjustments and profound pleasures. Simple things became significant. Arranging my schedule without consultation, leaving dishes in the sink if I chose, playing music without considering others' preferences, wearing the floral dress and other colorful additions to my wardrobe without commentary. I established new routines: Tuesday mornings at Vivian's writing workshop, Thursday evenings at the women's group, daily walks in the neighborhood park, weekend visits with the grandchildren. I set up a dedicated workspace for my editing and acquisition duties, complete with a comfortable chair and good lighting, a professional environment that respected the value of my work. Relationships shifted and recalibrated. Mark and I developed a new rhythm of communication: regular calls, Sunday dinners at his house or mine, genuine exchanges about our respective lives. Melissa remained somewhat distant, but gradually adjusted to the new arrangement, especially as she found a college student who could provide after-school childcare 3 days a week. The children adapted with the flexibility of youth. Aiden thought it was cool that Grandma had her own apartment, where he could visit and play video games without his sister interrupting. Emma was delighted with her special chair, a small armchair upholstered in purple velvet, that we had found together at a consignment shop, and the cookie jar that was always filled before her visits. My work continued to develop in satisfying directions. The trial period with Meridian Press evolved into a formal, part-time position as I demonstrated both my editorial judgment and my understanding of their target market. James Harrington was particularly pleased with an anthology concept. I had proposed a collection of essays by people who had embarked on significant life changes after 50, from career shifts to creative pursuits to geographical relocations. "This is exactly the kind of content our readers are looking for," he told me during our monthly in-person meeting. "Not how to accept limitation, but how to embrace continued growth. I'd like to fast-track this project. Can you have a formal proposal ready by next month?" I could, and did. The anthology was approved for the fall list, with a generous advance that would be split among the contributors. I would serve as both editor and contributor, sharing my own still unfolding story of reclamation alongside others. The book project with Vivian was also moving forward. The feminist press had accepted our proposal, offering a modest advance and a publication date the following spring. We were deep in the process of editing the collected essays, shaping them into a cohesive narrative about women refusing to disappear after 50. As winter gave way to spring, I found myself reflecting on the dramatic shift in my life's trajectory over the past 6 months, from the invisible grandmother in beige, defined by her utility to others, to an independent woman with meaningful work, creative projects, and genuine community. The change had not been without challenges. There had been moments of doubt, practical difficulties, emotional hurdles to overcome, but each step had built upon the last, creating a path toward increasing agency and visibility. One warm evening in May, I hosted a dinner party in my apartment, a celebration of both professional milestones and personal growth. Around my table sat the women who had become my circle: Vivian, Patricia, Helen, Ruth, and several others from our Thursday group. We had evolved from support network to genuine friends, sharing not just our struggles but our triumphs, our daily lives, our emerging dreams. As we raised our glasses in a toast to the anthology's upcoming publication, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, backlit by the warm light of the stained glass lamp, animated in conversation, radiantly present, not invisible, not ridiculous, not defined by age or marital status or maternal role, simply, fully myself, a woman reclaiming the right to matter on her own terms. A woman refusing to disappear. The floral dress hung in my closet now among many other colorful garments. No longer a symbol of transgression, but simply one option among many. I wore what pleased me, said what I thought, occupied space without apology. The journey wasn't complete. There would always be moments of doubt, instances of dismissal to resist, internal narratives to rewrite. But the direction was clear, the momentum established. I was 55 years old, and I was just getting started.